So with Diablo 4's impending monumental launch, many players are planning to dedicate not only its opening weekend to playing the game, but actually the entire week or potentially even longer. And of course, the main goal here is to have the most fun possible, but I'm also of the camp that each player can probably have a few things to optimize, such as learning about some of the game's important core mechanics or planning out one's character and leveling build to sort of streamline their experience to be able to avoid some potential frustration and ultimately even be able to potentially have more fun. So with that, here's my quick 11 tip checklist for an optimal Diablo 4 start. And with that, starting with tip number 1, and that's unless you prefer a challenge, which is definitely fine for the sake of, say, having more fun, especially on your first playthrough. For leveling and playing through the campaign, you'll want to generally stick with the lowest difficulty, which is World Tier 1. And just taking a step back to quickly explain this difficulty system in Diablo 4 in case you're not really aware, there are 4 different difficulties, but when you first start out, you'll only be able to choose from the first 2 difficulties, which are Adventurer, also known as World Tier 1, and then Veteran, which is also called World Tier 2. And currently, at least as of the previous round of testing, which means that this could, and the numbers could definitely change past the launch. Even though playing on World Tier 2 offers increased rewards, the increased difficulty is such that, or so much that it doesn't actually justify the increased rewards, making it actually still less efficient overall than playing on World Tier 1. Although some people again might find it more fun and challenging and might thus enjoy it more if they play on World Tier 2, right? So it really is up to you, but if you just solely care about efficiency and reaching the endgame as quick as possible, which is what I'll be wanting to do, and still be able to enjoy the campaign relatively well, I would suggest picking World Tier 1 primarily. And now for a slightly more advanced strategy and a bonus tip, if you will, and it's that whenever you get a significant power spike, such as when you unlock your class mechanic, like with the rogues when you unlock your combo points and inner sight, with this huge power spike at your current level, because again, when you're leveling up through the campaign, the world actually scales to your level, but once you get that power spike, it's not like a level increase, so the level of monster stays the same, but your character still gets a power spike, right? And hence, in that sort of window of a couple of levels after you unlock these types of power boosts, it might be good to actually switch to World Tier 2 temporarily, and again, you can easily switch between world tiers in your zone's main town, like Kyovashad of the Fractured Peaks, and then just consider switching back to World Tier 1 once you feel like your killing speed has begun to slow down. And with that, on to tip number 2, and still on the topic of leveling and progression, and that's that you should stick with the campaign quests or your main quests as a priority for leveling up. Which means that in Diablo 4, because there's an open world and a lot of different types of activities for you to gain experience, from just killing monsters in general to your side quests, which are optional side quests, and also things like strongholds and events. Aside from if you happen to encounter something along the way, like a quick and easy event or certain side quests even, and of course you can refer to certain guides when they come out on what side quests are actually worth doing, but I'll get to that tip later on. I sort of spilled the beans here. But anyhow, doing certain events along the way can be somewhat helpful for collecting not only gear, but also obols, which is a currency you'll be able to use for gambling if you need to, or eventually want to upgrade an item or whatever it is, right? So that could be somewhat helpful to do sparsely. And of course, another major exception to this is your class quests, which are mainly for unlocking certain class mechanics, like for example, the Druid's spirit boons with spirit animals, the rogue's class mechanics, specializations, the sorcerer's enchant slots, and the necromancer's golem, and so on and so forth. But aside from these things, getting the campaign done relatively quickly will then allow you to access the capstone dungeon, which is the end dungeon of World Tier 2, which will then allow you to unlock the next tier, which is Nightmare difficulty. And yet another benefit of focusing on the campaign is that many of the quests and bosses actually give or drop guaranteed rewards, such as useful rares and even legendary items, which will grant you a bit of insurance and sort of guaranteed power in case nothing really good drops along your leveling journey. And of course, another great perk of primarily progressing through the campaign is that you'll be able to unlock your mount, right? Which will allow you to traverse Sanctuary at a much quicker pace. On to tip number 3, and actually coming back to how to get more guaranteed useful items while leveling, and it's that there are certain named rare monsters that spawn in specific locations in each zone and also drop guaranteed items and can be killed multiple times too. And notably, at least the 3 rare mobs that spawn in the Fractured Peaks that we know of, each drop pretty useful items, again on demand, although they are somewhat niche and cannot be used by just any class or specialization. Although besides these 3, there are also bound to be other rare spawns that'll spawn in the other zones that you'll be leveling through. And so I'll link a guide to all the rare spawns that we know of so far. The, of course, Fractured Peaks ones are already on this guide, but as the guide gets updated with the additional zones, be sure to check back to see whether any of these named monsters that you may come across will actually drop a useful item for your specialization. And speaking of specializations and builds, and on to tip number 4, and that is to try to pick your builds beforehand and or follow leveling builds as you go, or even if you know what types of skills and mechanics are important to have in every build, that would actually allow you to formulate your own builds pretty easily as you progress and level up. Now for this, I'll actually link one of my other short videos below for 6 crucial features to include in every viable progression build. Because I think that knowing a lot of these concepts and knowing what is important and what to prioritize in a build is important in that you don't have to necessarily follow a specific build guide to a T, especially since Blizzard can always balance things pretty quickly and radically, especially close to the game's launch, right? There could definitely be a few balance updates that shake up the meta as soon as, say, the first few days after launch. And so just by understanding some of the mechanics and what is viable and how to efficiently progress, you'll not only be more self-sufficient and not necessarily have to rely heavily on guides that may actually become outdated pretty quickly unless, you know, those creators go and update their guides really fast after a balance update, but that's not super likely that they'll do it right away, right? And so not only that, but you'll then also be able to adapt much more quickly to, say, a balance update or even picking up a new legendary that'll make you want to switch your main skill and so forth. But even then, and with this knowledge, which you can still pick up by watching my linked video below for, again, 6 crucial things to include in most builds, you'll still want to try to plan a little bit ahead for the type of build that you want to go for when leveling. Because this will actually allow you to plan your leveling route somewhat, especially when it comes to what specific dungeons you're going to be targeting for those legendary powers that will boost your build. And this is in fact tip number 5, which is to identify the not only specific legendary powers that you want, but of course also the dungeons that you need to clear to get them. And this is particularly helpful because this is actually a form of insurance for certain specs, at least, for if no good legendaries drop for you throughout your leveling process. So with any of the aspects that you get from a dungeon, which again is a special augmentation to a skill, if you will, that you can imbue onto a rare item that will grant you bonuses to a certain skill, right? But the rolls will be a bit lower than if you were to get it from an actual item, but mechanically you'll be able to have that skill function in a new and improved way. And by the way, this also has some implications for your second and onwards playthroughs of the game, because after you clear the campaign once, you don't actually have to do it again on a second character and henceforth. And so if you've already cleared the campaign once, whenever you start a new character, it'll actually spawn in Act 1 in Kilvashad, but then you can actually run that character over to whatever zone you want, which will have potentially that dungeon that you'll want to shore up your spec right away, right? As opposed to having to follow the campaign thread, although the campaign itself is somewhat non-linear as well. But this way you can get to those dungeons and legendary powers that you plan for even faster. And by the way, for one generally fairly helpful legendary aspect, by the way, this is more of a defensive one, but you can actually get the aspect of the Protector, which will generate a barrier upon damaging an elite. That actually spawns, or that you can actually obtain from the Lost Archive dungeon in the Fractured Peaks, which is again Act 1. And on to tip number 6, and it's to learn item affixes and how exactly they work and whether they are useful to your character early on, so that whenever you pick up an item that can potentially be an upgrade, you'll be able to quickly figure out and know whether to replace an item or whether to keep it, whether to upgrade it, whether to imbue it with a legendary aspect, and thus to keep it for longer, and so on and so forth. That'll just save you some thinking and figuring things out along the way if you already know or have figured things out beforehand. And naturally, fortunately for you, I also have a video on how to quickly identify whether an item is an upgrade, especially for those with close-ish item power or different types of affixes. So be sure to check out that quick video, because with my tips, you'll undoubtedly be able to save tons of time by being able to tell whether an item is an upgrade or whether you should keep something at a glance. And of course, the link to that video along with all the other helpful ones will be in the description box. And with that, on to tip number 7, and that is to remember to utilize your crafters while leveling and progressing. And those include your alchemists for upgrading your health potions and creating helpful elixirs, which by the way, as you level up, you unlock additional elixirs. And these are also extremely important to use because each also grants you an EXP bonus buff. And then there's the blacksmith, which allows you to salvage your gear that you don't need for resources. And then also upgrade your items, especially your weapons, because again, weapon damage is very useful. We've also got the jeweler, who is pretty self-explanatory, but more specifically, they do add sockets to your items with a resource cost and also allow you to upgrade your gems and even your jewelry, which are your amulets and rings. And last but not least, the occultist allows you to re-roll affixes on your items that you don't necessarily need, and also imprint your rare items with legendary aspects, and they'll also be heavily involved with the crafting and upgrading of nightmare sigils for nightmare dungeons when you do unlock that feature. And yet again, for crafting, and more specifically how you can utilize crafting to the utmost potential to upgrade your character's power while progressing and leveling, and yet also save the most resources that you can, be sure to check out my other video that I'll link below when it's ready. Now for this next tip, I for once don't have a video, I'm preparing for it, but I'll instead link to a webpage guide for it. And the tip itself is to constantly check for updated map guides, which will be really helpful for locating things like Altar of Lilith, especially if they're pretty closely along the way of you progressing through the campaign, right? Because Altar of Lilith will actually give you stat bonuses. Now the guide I've linked below will already have pretty much everything you need to know about the Fractured Peaks, because again, it was extensively tested throughout the open beta and the recent server slam. But soon after release, the same guides but for the remaining other zones will also be updated and will allow you to, again, streamline your experience and better be able to pick up the useful Altars of Lilith, which will also double as contributing to your renown level, right? And of course, if you also have specific dungeons that you need to target for certain legendary powers for your build, you'll be able to much more easily do that as well. And on to tip number 9 real quick, and that is for your renown level progression, which are basically a series of perks that you can unlock in each zone by completing the various objectives or exploring each zone. While you're still leveling up through the campaign, you pretty much just want to complete the first level of renown for each zone and then come back to it after you've finished that campaign, say when you're preparing to do the capstone dungeon to enter Nightmare, or just keep progressing it after you enter Nightmare difficulty. And the main reason for this is that it's fairly easy, as it doesn't require you to complete that many objectives to gain that renown progression bar for each zone just to reach level 1. And even with just one level, you can gain some pretty good boosts, like an extra skill point or so from each zone. And just by doing this, you're not sacrificing too much time to spend on exploration and completing objectives, because your main goal is to go through the campaign and then complete the capstone dungeon, right? Of course, if you're still not geared enough or high enough level to do the capstone dungeon successfully, you can obviously then go back to keep leveling up your renown while you collect gear and power up your character for it. So anyhow, you don't want to spend too much time leveling up renown past level 1 while you're going through the campaign, because you just want to get through the campaign as quickly as possible and then get past the capstone dungeon as quickly as possible to get into Nightmare difficulty, where a lot of the main and rewarding endgame activities start happening. And on to tip number 10, and this is regarding gambling with obols. So in Diablo 4, there's also a gambling system similar to Diablo 3 and Diablo 2. And so while questing through Sanctuary, you'll inevitably come across these events that you can usually knock out really quickly. And especially if they spawn along your campaign trail, so to speak, you'll be able to collect this currency called obols, which you can then spend at the purveyor of curiosities, which is the gambler person, and be able to get random pieces of gear at your level, with different types of gear requiring different costs. And there are actually a couple of things I want to mention with this. The first of which is that your obols can actually cap out at 500 without any renown bonuses. So if you do level up some renown levels at certain zones, that cap might go up. But anyhow, you want to make sure that you're spending enough of your obols and frequently enough so that you don't overcap and essentially waste that resource that you might be getting from events. And secondly, as for what to target with your obols, generally speaking, weapons are a pretty good choice because when you gamble, the items that come out will match your character's level, and even if you don't spawn one with really good affixes, at least the weapon damage roll will be high enough for your level, right? And then in general, if you just have a piece that's sort of lagging behind a level, you can also consider gambling on that specific piece. Or if you need to shore up more offense or defense, you can choose to gamble different types of pieces for ones that either generally contain more offensive affixes like gloves or defensive affixes like chest pieces and pants. And last but not least, finally for tip number 11, and that is that partying up with other players actually grants an EXP bonus. And not only that, but when you're in a party and when you are in town and your party members are out and about in the overworld or vice versa, you can easily teleport to each other just from the portal you take from town. And so the actual main tip and takeaway here is to not abandon and always remember and cherish your social connections and your friends despite a huge game coming out like Diablo 4. And so this is just a reminder to not become completely antisocial because you can actually benefit from having friends and other players that play with you in Diablo 4. So with that, don't be a stranger. Be sure to comment down below what you think and what your plans for Diablo 4 are starting out. Thank you so much for watching this video. Be sure to check out the additional, more specific guides that are linked below that greatly expand upon these tips. And you can also consider subscribing to my channel for more cutting edge guides just like this one for Diablo 4. And with that, I will see you in the next video. Peace.